Okay, so we have a very special event today in honor of Black History Month. It's our last in-class, on-campus event. And we have a rare opportunity to listen to a very rare recording. And so before I introduce to you our guest speakers, I'm going to play just a short clip of the great Dr. Martin Luther King, revolutionary for radical change. If it's okay with Dr. Luther.
No, it's not.
I know, I was going to say that.
We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So I want to introduce to you a few of the great people of Merritt College, Peralta. Here in Peralta, we don't just study history, we do history. And so really, I really mean these introductions respectfully, because I literally would not be in this position if it weren't for the faculty before me. I don't know why Dr. Love is always laughing, because I am telling the truth. He helped build the Black Studies Department, supported its continuation and growth. As a matter of fact, even making sure that it continued past the most recent retirement. And Dr. Herring is the current president of Merritt College and has been active and involved since for decades at Merritt College and in Peralta. So they're going to introduce our keynote speaker, but I want to introduce you to Dr. Bill Love, who many of you know, who heads the COSTAR program, and Dr. George Herring, who's the president of Merritt College. Please welcome them to our conference. And we have another special guest, another great leader of Peralta with long history in Peralta strengthening our colleges, is Dr. Wise Allen, the chancellor of all 4 colleges of the district. Always all point, putting on events and holding us all together. So welcome them all. Thank you.
Well, Siri likes to make fun of me. You know, I was bothering her one day, and so she made it her mission in life. Whenever she sees me, I'm going to make fun of her. 2 or 3 things that are important, though, is she's in fact helped the Black Studies program grow. It was in fact in just me one time, but she's helped to grow. But the purpose of being here today is to introduce the speaker, who is one of my closest friends. We started teaching at the College of Alameda for years, and our goal in life, I don't know what happened, was when we retired to do nothing but play tennis. That goal has gone away. But when we were working, people knew after 2 o'clock where to find us. Because if the sun was out and it had not rained that morning, we were on the tennis courts. And so people would come out to find us on the tennis courts. Les did his thesis on Martin Luther King. He's a political scientist, and he's one of those individuals who are dwindling now, who can actually say they spent a significant amount of time with Dr. Martin Luther King. And the most interesting part of it, he recorded this information, and his recordings, like the recording you saw, are getting old. Most of you don't know what that speech did, but for those of us who were alive, it still gives you chills. Because the next day, he was killed. So it's still, when you hear him talk, it gives you chills. Mr. Margolies is a scholar, a gentleman, and he has the best forehand in America. Mr. Les Marantz,
well,
Dr.
George
Harry, who has the best backhand.
I'm going to be real quick. Les and I worked together when I was president at Alameda. And we were talking one day, and he said, you know, George, when I was getting my, was it master's, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When I was getting my master's, I had an occasion to interview Dr. King. He was in jail. And he was allowed to meet Dr. King while he was in jail, and Les was the one that had the opportunity to, what you're going to hear now. So when I was president, I said, okay, Les, I want you to come and speak to the Rotary. And sure enough, Black History Month, Les was the main speaker at the Rotary in Alameda. And then I said, okay, that's great, but I want you to tell the students. So during that next day or two, I asked Les to speak before the students at the college. And so it gives me real tremendous pressure. Now, in terms of tennis, they're both pretty good. They're both pretty good.
Rosie better dip.
You know, I hit them so that they couldn't touch me. Anyway, Les Margolies, our friend, I'm sure what he's going to say to you is going to be inspiring. And just imagine him with his little, whatever.
Oh, I had a big recorder. Yeah, I had a big recorder.
Was recording Dr. King, so you're going to be thrilled. Les, you're on, buddy.
Thanks, baby.
What you really have to imagine is the gringo following the king around. In Atlanta,
you're on, Les.
reporter was,
I just want to make one correction. I did interview Dr. King. I did it in Atlanta, but it wasn't in jail. It was at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he was co-pastor with his father. So that would be the only thing. I think you remembered it maybe in jail. It would have been a better interview, perhaps. Right. But thank you very much. And students, guests, welcome. Thank you, Dr. Brown, and my longtime friend, Dr. Herring, for inviting me to speak today. Dr. Love, as you see, is here today. He's always obvious when he's here, so a special, very special hello to him. Please note, next Monday is his birthday. And it's on the 27th, and so that's one of the privileges that comes with being one's closest friend for the past 40 years, is that I have the right to embarrass him in public, which is difficult to do, by the way. Dr. Allen is here. I know Dr. Allen longer than anybody. His wife and he and my wife were social workers together in Alameda County in the early 1960s. So if you can calculate how far back that goes, that's how long we know each other. And my wife used to work with Bill Love's mother, Lillian Love. So we go back a long way. I'd like to begin today by talking about some events that led me to get to where I was when I went to interview Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In March of 1961. And the first event has to be World War II. 50 million people were killed. There was a Holocaust. 6 million were killed only because they were Jewish. The UN was established in 1945. So 1945 is the end of World War II. We won. 1947 is a year I want to talk about just briefly. Jackie Robinson became a Brooklyn Dodger. The color line in baseball was broken. A very significant event. Not everybody on his team embraced him. The fans in Brooklyn embraced him, but not everybody on his team. And around the league, not so much. He got thrown out a lot, and they didn't have helmets in those days. And then the Dodgers got a pitcher by the name of Don Newcomb, and he was black, and he threw pellets. And if you threw at Robinson, he threw at not only the pitcher who threw at him, but their best player. So other teams broke out in fights if a pitcher threw at Robinson and managed especially to hit him. And then, magically, they stopped throwing at Jackie Robinson. To this day, he is the most exciting baseball player, not the best, but the most exciting I've ever seen play baseball. Just an amazing man. 1947, India and Pakistan were liberated from Great Britain and they became nations. Who led that fight? Anybody know? He was a great influence on Martin Luther King Jr., one of his mentors. Mahatma Gandhi, the great one, yeah, absolutely. 1948, just talked about World War II. It took Harry Truman to issue an executive order, he was our president, on July 26th, to desegregate our armed forces. We fought all of World War II, the segregated armed forces. And then 1953 is what we call a sea change in the United States Supreme Court. The Chief Justice died. Anybody here have any idea how many Chief Justices we've had since 1789? How many presidents have we had? 44. 44. Barack Obama is 44. Okay. We've had 17 since 1789. Well, the Chief Justice was Fred Vinson, and he died. And Dwight Eisenhower, World War II, 5-star general, was then president, and he appointed Earl Warren to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. My mind, the best Chief Justice we ever had. Nobody has been alike. No one has been like him before or since. He had been 3-time governor of California, elected governor. He had been the Attorney General of Alameda County. He had been the Attorney General of California, the state. And now he was Chief Justice. 1 year later, he got all 9 justices in a unanimous opinion. One of the most important dates in American history. May 17th. To this day, when May 17th comes around, I have a drink. May 17th, 1954. Oh, maybe more. May 17th, 1954, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. It overturned the Plessy Doctrine. It held separate but equal facilities in public schools are inherently unequal. Think about that. Separate but equal facilities. The Plessy Doctrine said it was okay to have separate as long as the facilities were equal. They never were. So, if it's unconstitutional to have separate facilities in public schools, what about public parks? What about public bathrooms? What about all public facilities? Why would it be? And so that case, that precedent started overturning all the Jim Crow laws around. It began the process of overturning segregation. And then it fell in private segregated facilities as well. So then December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus and was arrested. I think probably you all know her story. Soon after, a boycott ensued. The leader of the boycott was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The young minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and he led that successful boycott for 381 days. The black people of Montgomery walked, they carpooled, maybe they took a taxi cab, but they didn't ride the buses, and the bus company was willing to give in within a few days. But they did cave in finally, 381 days later. In 1957, Dr. King was elected the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we call it the SCLC, to provide leadership for the now burgeoning civil rights movement in America. In 1959, I had a good friend who was trying to desegregate some of the segregated stores in the town where we went to college. It was in Carbondale, Illinois, at Southern Illinois University. My good friend's name is Roland Burris. Anybody know who he is? He's not related to John Burris. Anybody know who Roland Burris is? He just retired as the United States Senator from the state of Illinois. Of Illinois, yeah. 1960, February 1st, a sit-in by 4 black freshman male students at a Woolworth in Greensboro, North Carolina. This was the spark that ignited sit-ins throughout the South. The date, February 1st, 1960, is the official date that starts the beginning of the civil rights movement in America. It's an artificial date because you see things were happening before then, but that's the date that's officially given. If you're asked that on a test by Dr. Brown, I would use that date. 1961, May 4th, just after I met Martin Luther King Jr. and interviewed him at Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Freedom Rides began. White and black students got on buses and they wanted to desegregate throughout the South. They drove from Atlanta into the Deep South trying to desegregate railroads and buses, and they got beat up, and they got pummeled, and the nation was on their side. Had a lot to do, and they won ultimately. One of my heroes, John Lewis, was one of them sitting on those buses. I'll give you some trivia. Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite hymn was "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." He was arrested 30 times in his lifetime for what? For trespass, disturbing the peace, breach of the peace, malicious mischief, vagrancy, parading without a permit, demonstrating without a permit. These laws, there are many of them still on the books today to allow people to be arrested for exercising constitutional rights, and are mostly incompatible with a free and democratic society. I arrived in Atlanta, Georgia on March 15, 1961. I had an exciting and educational week prior to my interview with Dr. King because of a librarian that I was friendly with at Southern Illinois University. The librarian, who was black, saw in me a feisty student who objected to being ushered out of the library at closing time. I argued that libraries should never be closed because they were the repositories of information, knowledge, and perhaps even wisdom. She countered by saying that if you want to impress me with your wisdom, then think of something real stupid to say and then don't say it. She also reminded me that no other part of the university was open, the political science department, the math department. Why should libraries stay open? So we had this ongoing friendly quarrel. And then she found out that I was going to interview Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., going to Atlanta, and it turned out that Atlanta was her hometown. So without my knowledge, she arranged for me to meet a black detective on the Atlanta police force and a student leader at Atlanta University Center. His name is Lonnie C. King Jr., and he's been involved in human rights and civil rights virtually his whole life. He graciously took me to all of the historic, notice I said the word historic, black colleges in Atlanta, and introduced me to the leaders of SNCC, the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and many of the professors at these colleges. When I was asked why I was visiting Atlanta and I told them, some of the professors snickered. They wondered why I would come there to interview merely a preacher. They had their doctorates from Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and they didn't think much of preachers, flat out. Lonnie C. King Jr., as I said, has been a leader in civil rights from that time on. Incidentally, when I attended Southern Illinois University, the comedian Dick Gregory was there. Anybody know who Dick Gregory is? Just raise your hand. All right. After I was there, Walt Frazier was there. Anybody know who he is? He's in the Basketball Hall of Fame. All right. On March 22nd, 1961, I met Martin Luther King Jr. at Ebenezer Baptist Church. March 22nd, 1961. He was then co-pastor with his father. We had corresponded to set up that date, time, and place to meet. I was 23 years old. He was 32. He was my hero then. He is my hero today. A word about his name. When he was born, he was named Michael. But when he was a toddler, his father changed his name to make it after himself, Martin Luther King Jr. It's not a coincidence that my son is named Michael Martin. In a wide range of subjects, we talked about oppression, how to achieve justice and equality through nonviolent resistance, economic boycotts, voting laws, Supreme Court decisions, morality, his father, even which political party at that time was doing more to address the needs of black people in America. Before I play some of my interview with Dr. King, I would ask your indulgence. I want to tell you a story of an experience I had a couple of years ago with grade schoolers. Nowadays, around Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and this January 15th, I believe he would have been 84, right around his birthday, built into many curriculums across the nation and in California, students study Martin Luther King Jr., what he meant to America. And my granddaughter was then in the second grade, and she mentioned to her teacher that, well, my grandpa, you know, he interviewed Dr. King and he has it on tape. Well, the teacher got very excited. And she talked to other teachers, and before long, I was invited to talk to, for 50 minutes, the whole first grade. Then the next hour, the whole second grade. And the next hour, the whole third grade. And you know, this was very daunting to me because I had been a college teacher for all my life, and now I have to talk to first graders and second graders. What can I tell them? What, how truthful could I be with them? Could I tell them what was really going on, what really happened? I didn't want them to have nightmares. I didn't want them to have to go to a psychiatrist because I came to talk to them. So I showed them a picture of Ebenezer Baptist Church where I met Martin Luther King Jr. and interviewed him. And then I pulled out a book and I showed him this book, and I said, and look here, when he was 5, he went over to visit some little white boys who were friends with him, and the mother said, you can't play with my boys anymore, and he ran home crying to his mother. And I thought, you know, they could identify with that. But I couldn't tell them about Emmett Till, about Cheney, Goodwin, and Schwerner, how they were brutalized, tortured, murdered. I couldn't tell them about Sheriff Clark. I couldn't bring myself of Selma, Alabama. I couldn't talk about Eugene Bull Connor of Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, we used to call Bombingham. So many homes were blown up. A church was blown up. The 16th Street Avenue Baptist Church. 4 little black girls were killed. When people came out of churches on Sunday, Eugene Bull Connor would have the firefighters turn turn the fire hoses on them because they drank from whites-only water fountains, and grandmothers and grandfathers and little children and moms and dads were swept down the streets. I didn't want the kids. I tried to save them from that brutal humanity, that inhumanity, that evil. And maybe I was wrong. But then I said after I had this little talk, I played a little bit of my tape, which you're about to hear soon, with them. Of course, they wouldn't understand too much. I played some so they could hear me and Dr. King exchanging our words. And then I said, but you know, in 1968, Dr. King found himself in Memphis, Tennessee. Shortly after that night, the mountaintop speech, which we just heard. Found himself there in support of the sanitation workers. And he was with other ministers, and he was staying at the Lorraine Motel. The date was April 4th, 1968. And he walked out onto the table, and he was shot. Well, up until this time, the students were very polite. Who knows what they were doing, and maybe words with friends, I don't know. But they weren't, they were just polite. Now, hands went up all over the place. Where was he shot? Call him. In the face. Was there a lot of blood? Yes, there was. Was he killed? Yes, he died. Who killed him? A very bad man named James Earl Ray. Where is he? It's all coming from questions from the class. He's, well, he escaped for a while, but then he was captured and he was tried and convicted, and he went to prison, and he died in prison not too long ago. And then I called on a little girl, and she said, my uncle died 2 weeks ago. Then I called on a little boy, and he said, we forgot to give my grandpa his medicine, and he died the next day. That was the hardest moment. That was the hardest moment I had in all my 40-plus years teaching. And you try to be empathetic. You try to, I looked at all the teachers, and they're all laughing. That's a true story.
What do you feel will be the general repercussions of this movement on contemporary American politics and contemporary American thought?
Well, I'm sure that this movement will have a tremendous impact on both the political structure of our nation as well as the thought. I think first to deal with the political side, I'm sure that the whole movement of the Negro, or to put it another way, the whole civil rights struggle will tend to liberalize both political parties to a degree, because the more the Negro secures a ballot, the more the Democratic Party, for instance, will have to break away from the Southern Dixiecrats and move more in line with its basic principles. And I think to a degree, the more this movement goes on, the more it will break down the coalition in Congress between right-wing Northern Republicans and Southern Dixiecrats, which in the long run will make for a greater liberal bent and more progressive legislation in several areas. Now, as far as the movement's influence on contemporary thought, I think it will have a great impact there. For instance, the movement represents certainly a new and creative dimension in the struggle in the United States. In the past, it has been mainly legalistic, and now we see the birth of this new approach, not new approach, but new in America on a mass scale, namely nonviolent resistance. And I'm sure that with this new dimension coming in, more and more people will begin to study the meaning of nonviolent resistance as a philosophy and as a technique of social change. I think also many of the stereotypes concerning the Negro are gradually being removed from the thinking of people because of this movement. They've come to see a different type of Negro than the Negro that they had in their minds.
I want to skip a little, thank you. When I was interviewing him, the phone often rang. And he would, sometimes I turned the recorder off, sometimes I didn't. He'd say, oh, I have to delay, I can't see you till a little later. So, you might want to remember that. Then I asked him about an agreement that had been made in Atlanta with some of the big department stores, and it was disputed. Many members of the black community thought that agreement shouldn't have been signed, that it wasn't strong enough. It had to do with hiring, desegregation, and the newspapers said that Martin Luther King says we can live with this agreement. So I asked him about that, and his response was, yeah, he says, I didn't say it. My father did. Well, the papers often used his father. They quoted his father to embarrass him. And so his father was an old-fashioned Baptist minister. And he didn't have the same views as his son by any stretch. He didn't want to vote for John Kennedy for a while because he was a Catholic. But I'm going to skip a little and then we can come back. I want to come back. You'll hear the last part of that, talking about that agreement.
The agreement. Well, they backed up and they had to change that. Then the second thing came out was a statement that my father made, and they quoted this as my statement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, this was a statement that my father made for the radio station WGST.
Is this the one I just...
That's the one.
That's not the one.
I think that's the one. Well, they made two. That's one. The other one was the statement that I said, I think the plan is workable, and I call for full support. Now, that was my father. See, I was out of town.
I know.
When that happened.
Right?
That's right, I was in Detroit. But they quoted me as making this statement, you see, and then the other one came out that I think it is something we can live with, which I have never said. So this was all a part of the tragedy of errors in this whole thing.
All right, let's get off this. I'm cleared up on it. I was even before I answered that question. In regard to civil disobedience, some Southerners now are claiming to be resisting the Supreme Court decision on a strictly ethical basis. How does this position differ with your own nonviolent one?
First, I haven't seen any Southerners really resisting it on an ethical basis. But I would say this, if they do, I think they should have a right to do that. If one is committed purely to the legalistic way through the courts, you must give the opposition the right to appeal, to use the same approach. I mean, he uses the same method. He can go to court. He can go up to the Supreme Court. He may lose or he may win, but you give him that same, he has that same right. I think the same way in a nonviolent campaign, that if you insist that it is right to break what conscience tells you is an unjust law, then you must also give this man over here the right to break an unjust law, that conscience tells him is unjust, you see. And I tell him I'll be on in just a minute. And the only thing that I would say is this, that in breaking that unjust law, the individual must first be nonviolent. He should be peaceful in breaking it. He should have a loving attitude. He shouldn't be cursing, and he shouldn't be throwing out all of these vitriolic expressions that we find in New Orleans. I don't think that's civil disobedience. I think it's uncivil disobedience. And third, he must be willing to voluntarily and cheerfully accept the penalty for breaking an unjust law. Now, this is different from evading the law. This is what I think the Southern reactionaries are doing. They are defying the law, which I think is wrong. They are seeking to evade the law, which I think is wrong. But the individual who breaks an unjust law, a law which conscience tells him is unjust, and willingly accepts the penalty for it, is expressing the highest respect for law. And he's not an anarchist, you see. He respects law, but he sees that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. A just law, from a purely moral point of view, is one that squares with what is morally right and certain basic principles of respect for the dignity and worth of human personality, so that any law that degrades human personality is unjust. But not only that, an unjust law is a law in which the majority imposes upon the minority a code that it does not impose upon itself, that is not binding on itself. It is also a law which the majority imposes on the minority, which that minority had no part in creating or enacting, because they don't have the right to vote in many instances. So that most of the legislative bodies in the South that make these anti-trespass laws or what have you, I would contend, are not legally elected. The people did not elect them. In Mississippi, only 20,000 Negroes vote over the whole state, and yet they are about 48% of the population. So that this is an unjust law, not on the basis of morality, but on the basis of just observable facts, you see.
Dr. King, suppose the Supreme Court had made a decision confirming segregation.
Tell him I'll have to call him back. Just kidding.
Suppose the Supreme Court had made a decision confirming segregation.
What you mean? What would I advocate?
Yeah, at this point.
I would say if the Supreme Court rendered a decision advocating segregation, I would urge people to resist that decision nonviolently. People have resisted the Supreme Court's decision before. In 1857, the Supreme Court rendered the Dred Scott decision. This decision was morally wrong. It said in substance that the Negro is not a citizen of the nation, he's merely property. He has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. Now, this was morally wrong. Even the Plessy Doctrine of 1896 was morally wrong, I think, and people resisted this decision. Most of the resistance was legal, but there has been nonviolent resistance to it. So I would say today, if the Supreme Court rendered a decision declaring segregation constitutional, I would urge people to resist that decision nonviolently, peacefully, and if necessary, to break some law that is set up on the basis of the decision, to accept the consequences and stay in jail in order to arouse the conscience of the community so that the law can be altered. Now, there is nothing new about civil disobedience, as you well know. I mean, academic freedom to a degree is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. The early Christians mastered civil disobedience to the point of being thrown before the lions and everything else, refusing to accept certain laws that had come down through the Roman Empire, and that they had to worship certain gods that the Roman Empire set up. They practiced open civil disobedience. Everything that Hitler did in Germany was legal, in quotes. Everything that the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. Now, it was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew during the time of Hitler in Germany. If I had lived in Germany, I would have openly, I believe, advocated disobeying this, and would have urged people to practice civil disobedience. The Boston Tea Party in our own history was a clear-cut case of civil disobedience. Even to a degree, the Underground Railroad and the revolt against the fugitive slave laws. So that it just so happens now, which is a wonderful thing in the United States, that what we find in conscience to be right, we find in fact to be constitutional, and this is good. This isn't true in South Africa. So I would tell the people in South Africa to disobey those laws. But what we find in the United States is that we are practicing civil disobedience as far as local laws down in the South are concerned. But we are really practicing civil disobedience to the federal law. We are really just trying to affirm the Constitution. And the question about the Supreme Court is just a hypothetical one, because so far the Supreme Court has been consistent in upholding the laws as they relate to the question of integration. So that's about my answer on that.
So I said there was a lot more. There was a lot more, and you know, we talked about, I asked them about the unit system in Georgia. It was a way of allocating legislators by way of property, not people. So that meant that the rural areas of the state got lots of legislators, and they could, and they were the most racist. And they could dominate the rest of the state. People lived in places like Atlanta and so forth. And we talked about that, and it was not, and he said, I think the unit system is going to fall. And sure enough, it did. And it did, remember I spoke about Earl Warren when he said, one person, one vote. So throughout the United States, one person, one vote. Land doesn't vote, trees don't vote, lakes don't vote, only people can vote. There's one massive constitutional exception to this rule. One massive exception to the rule of one person, one vote in this country. Anybody might know what it is? No, you can vote. The United States Senate. Alaska, with Wasilla and about 100,000 people, whatever, in the rest of the state, gets the same 2 senators as California. There are 40 million people. And that's built into the Constitution. Some think it's the Article 5 of the Constitution. Nor shall any state give up its equal representation in the Senate without its consent. They don't even think they can amend that. So that's the one exception to that rule. And we can't get over that one. I wish we could, maybe. It would be good. After I had this interview with Dr. King, then in 1963, he gave his famous in the March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech. In 1964, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And Lyndon Johnson, the president, signed the most important civil rights law ever handed down, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Martin Luther King had everything to do with that, and he was there for the signing. And 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act, we talked about voting, and Martin Luther King was most responsible for that. So we talked about what happened on April 4th. In 1986, Martin Luther King Jr. Day was established as a national holiday. And I just want to say that his if I were asked about his legacy, I would say this. And it doesn't do him justice. I would say he inspired pride, hope, and dignity in Black America. I would say he gave a conscience to white America. I would say, if you want to know why Barack Obama is President of the United States today, I would say look to Martin Luther King Jr. And his message was, Siri, Dr. Brown? Did you have your hand up? Okay, all right. So I just want to say his message was equality and freedom, the end of poverty, hunger, and injustice, and war through nonviolence. That was his message. So that's why we have a national holiday for him. So if I can take a question, but I want to thank you all for being here today. It was a great pleasure for me to
at the time that he was pitching all these ideas, did you think that the public would really grasp the ideas and actually do it? Or was it just like a fluke?
Well,
did you think he was out of his mind?
No, it really took nonviolence. It took demonstrations. It took boycotts. It took, I talked about Sheriff Eugene Bull Connor. When the American people on television looked at all those wonderful, decent black Americans with 700 pounds of water pressure being blown down the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, when they looked at that, that did a lot. So even that evil man did much, because the next year we got the Civil Rights Act. Next year we got the Voting Rights Act. No, it all had to be, and I asked, one of the things I asked Dr. King was, I said, what about, and that was the last thing I asked him, right after he just finished what he just said, I said, what about this idea of coercion? He said, well, it's always better to persuade people. But we need, I mean, that's what nonviolence is. We're going to put ourselves, we're going to get arrested. We're going to be in their face. We're going to do it nonviolently. We're going to do it lovingly, but we're going to demonstrate our convictions. And people aren't going to want to do this voluntarily. We got to drag them to do the right thing. Young man.
Why isn't this holiday recognized everywhere? Like some jobs don't get a day off.
Well, it's a public holiday. It's not a private one. So all public institutions, public schools, so banks and local stores and stuff, they don't, you could still go to Costco or whatever. But
any more questions? All right, let's thank Mr. Margolies one more time for coming here. And I thank you all. And I know you have classes to get to. Come up and say hello to our chancellor, to our president. Introduce yourself. Let them know how much you love Merritt College.